35 years of pastoral ministry, 35 years of standing at the head of a casket, choosing words for people who needed to believe something waited on the other side. I held their hands. I gave the sermon. I drove home after every one of those 47 funerals and told myself I knew what I was talking about. I didn't. I had no idea. And what I'm about to tell you is not the comfort you expect from a pastor. It is not the warm light and the peaceful music and the relatives waiting to embrace you. What I saw when my heart stopped on November 4th, 1991 for 52 minutes. What Jesus himself walked me through will change the way you think about every person alive right now who lives as though none of this is real. I'm going to keep the promise I made when I came back, to tell the truth, regardless of the cost. I've lost relationships over this account. I've had people walk out of my church. I have been called unstable, grief-stricken, and worse. I am telling you this because you cannot get it anywhere else in the way I am going to give it to you now. If you've never subscribed to this channel, do it before this testimony ends. Because what I'm about to tell you will change how you understand what was brought back from that room. The monitor flatlines at 2:47 in the afternoon, and I am already gone before the third alarm sounds. That is the clinical fact. I know it because the attending physician documented it. I know the exact time because it is written in the chart that my wife still keeps in the fireplace drawer, folded inside a manila envelope she hasn't opened since 1993. November 4th, 1991. Corinth, Mississippi. Tishomingo County Hospital, room 114, second floor. I am 53 years old, and I am the senior pastor of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and I have just preached on a Sunday morning about the faithfulness of God, eaten pot roast at Elaine's parents' table, driven home, and walked into my kitchen to pour a glass of sweet tea when the pain in my chest arrives with the force of something that has no intention of letting go. I know what a cardiac event feels like now. I did not know then. What I knew then, as a pastor, as a man who had read every major theological commentary on death and the afterlife available in English, was how to perform certainty in the face of it. That is what 35 years in ministry trains you to do. You learn the vocabulary. You learn the cadence. You learn how to hold the hand of a dying man and speak with the authority of someone who has read the map, even if you have never walked the road. I had read the map. I had never walked the road. The man who died in room 114 that afternoon, I call him the pastor because he is not quite the same person who is speaking to you now. The pastor had a theology. He had a denomination. He had a pulpit and a congregation and a library of 2,400 books and a doctor of divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. He had credentials that he had spent 3 decades accumulating, and he wore them the way a person wears the answer to the question of who they are. His identity was entirely professional, not in a cynical way, in a way that he had never stopped long enough to examine. When someone asked who he was, the answer was always the title. It was always the role. And every single one of those things dissolved in the first 3 seconds after my heart stopped. Not gradually, not painfully. They dissolved the way a title dissolves when you speak it in a room where no one knows the language. They became noise. They became shapes without meaning. The man underneath the pastor, the one who had always been there, the one who was present before the ordination and before the seminary and before the first time I stood up in front of a congregation and said, "Thus saith the Lord," that man remained. Just him, just the essential thing. No credentials, no authority, no title, just the soul. I did not feel my body stop. What I felt was a lifting, not metaphorical, physical. The weight I had been carrying every waking moment of 53 years. The weight of gravity, of responsibility, of accumulated worry, of the body's 10,000 daily negotiations with pain and fatigue and hunger. It lifted. In an instant. And the thing that remained was awake in a way that the body had never permitted. Awake in a way that I can only describe as complete. As though I had been looking through a pinhole my entire life, and someone had finally removed the wall. I was above the room before I understood what had happened. I can tell you the color of the floor tiles. I can tell you that the telephone receiver was still on its hook because Elaine had not yet reached the kitchen. I can tell you that my left hand was open at my side and my right was pressed to my chest, and I looked, from above, like a man who had finally put something down. I watched the paramedics arrive. I watched them work. I watched them use their equipment and call out numbers to each other and work with the specific focus of people who do not allow themselves to think about the person and think only about the procedure. I was not offended by that. I was grateful for it. And I was not afraid. That is the thing that surprises people most when I tell it. The complete and total absence of fear. Not peace exactly. Not joy. Just a clarity that had no room in it for fear. And then Jesus was beside me. I say it that way because that is how it was. Not a gradual arrival. Not a building presence. Beside me. As though he had always been there, and the lifting had simply removed the obstruction that prevented me from perceiving him. And I want to be precise about this, because I know what people hear when a pastor says those words. They hear the theological reflex. They hear the trained language of someone who has spent decades speaking about Christ, and they assume the experience is being filtered through the vocabulary of a profession. They assume I am interpreting an ambiguous light or a general sense of warmth through the framework of my training. It was not that. What I perceived was not vocabulary. It was a person, a presence with weight and warmth and a kind of attention that I have spent 30 years since that day trying to describe and have not yet managed to get right. He did not speak first. He looked at me with the full knowledge of who I was. Not who I had performed being, not the doctor of divinity, not the senior pastor, not the man who gave the sermons that people in Corinth, Mississippi quoted back to their children, but who I was. The man, the essential thing. And that look contained everything. There was no accusation in it. There was no assessment. There was only complete knowledge offered as complete love, and the combination of those two things would have destroyed me if I had still had a body to be destroyed with. Then he said, "There are things I need you to see. I want you to hold what I am about to say very carefully, because I know what it costs to hear it. We did not go toward the light first. We went down. I don't have a word for what we moved through. It was not darkness in the way that darkness works here. It was the absence of something I had not previously understood as a presence. The absence of grace. That is the closest I can come. Not the absence of light. Not the absence of warmth, though those were absent too. The absence of grace. The absence of the undergirding thing. The floor that you walk on your entire life and never look down to see, and which is removed here, and the removal of which changes the quality of every moment in a way that cannot be overstated. We were passing through a place where grace had been refused so completely and for so long that the refusal had become its own atmosphere. And the sound of it, because there was sound, was the sound of human voices stripped of everything except the voice underneath the voice, the register of the self that could not be hidden anymore. And what it said, in every voice, without variation, was that it had known. It had known and it had chosen otherwise. Not out of ignorance, out of choice. Repeated, accumulated, finally crystallized choice. The grief that rose in me as we moved through that place was not my own. This is crucial. I want you to understand this. The grief I felt was his. It was the grief of someone watching, for the full length of every one of those lives. Every moment where the choice was made, every moment where it could have gone differently, every moment where the love he had extended was taken and used and set aside. And the grief had no anger in it. That was what was most impossible to hold. The grief had no anger. It was pure sorrow, the sorrow of love refused. And I understood, for the first time in 53 years of preaching about these things, what the word mercy actually means. Mercy is what you have when the grief has no anger in it. That is mercy. We arrived at a place I will call the threshold of what I saw, because what was beyond it, what was on the other side of the boundary I could perceive, is something I was not permitted to see fully. What I was shown was the approach, the immediate region, and standing in that region, visible to me in a clarity that had no mercy in it and no softening, were people. I recognize some of them. I am going to tell you what I can tell you. I am not going to speak every name aloud, partly because some of what I was shown felt like a warning and not a proclamation, and I have prayed for 30 years over the question of how much to say. Partly because the moment you hear specific names, many of you will stop listening to the larger truth that the names were only there to confirm. But I will tell you what I saw, and I will trust you to understand the weight of it. There was a man I recognized who had, in his lifetime, been the most powerful religious broadcaster in the English-speaking world. A man whose voice had reached millions every week, whose face was on the cover of magazines, whose empire of ministry had touched every continent. A man who had spoken the name of Jesus with more frequency and more visibility than almost any person in the 20th century. You would know this man. You have seen photographs of him. You have heard his name invoked as evidence of what Christian ministry looks like at its most impactful. His ministry had shaped denominations and influenced elections and been cited in theological textbooks as the model of evangelical outreach, and whose private life, which was exposed eventually, as these things always are, was a transaction, not a faith, a transaction. He had built something enormous for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power, and the construction was so convincing that even he, by the end, may have forgotten that it was constructed. He was not there as a surprise. He was there as an answer to the question I had never dared ask aloud. Does God see the difference? Does God see the difference between a man who uses the language of faith as a vehicle for the accumulation of influence and a man who means it? God sees the difference. There was a man I recognized who had held a position of political authority, not a pastor, a statesman, a man whose public identity was inseparable from his stated faith, who had opened meetings with prayer and closed them with scripture, and been photographed in church pews and spoken at prayer breakfasts, and been endorsed by religious leaders who vouched for his character. A man who had made decisions from behind that desk that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, decisions made in the full knowledge of what they would produce, with the vocabulary of justification prepared in advance. He wore the language of faith like a professional uniform. He had never once put it on believing it was more than a uniform. There was a man I recognized who had been worshipped by a generation, whose music, whose image, whose entire constructed self had been offered to the world as a religion of the body, of appetite, of the self without limit or consequence. A man whose influence on the young people who came into my congregation during a specific decade I spent years trying to counter and redirect. I had counseled young people who were damaged by what this man had normalized, the contempt for commitment, the worship of image over substance, the performance of invulnerability that left them unable to ask for help when they needed it. Standing in that place, he did not look like he had in life. He looked like what he was underneath the construction. And underneath the construction was someone who had been given gifts of extraordinary magnitude and had used every single one of them for the expansion of himself. I tell you this not to make you afraid, though I understand if it does. I tell you this because Jesus showed it to me, and Jesus does not show things without a reason, and the reason he showed it to me was not condemnation. It was instruction. He communicated, almost without words, and that way that communication worked in that place, which was total and immediate and impossible to misunderstand. He communicated, this is what it looks like when a person uses my name without knowing me. This is what it looks like when the faith is a construction and not a life. This is what it looks like from here. And this is the reason I am telling you. Because those men are not uniquely evil. That is the terrifying part. Those men are the logical conclusion of something that is available to every person who has ever been given a platform and a title and the opportunity to build. The construction begins innocently enough. It begins with genuine belief. Somewhere along the road, the belief becomes the brand. The faith becomes the product. The name of God becomes the currency. And the man, the actual man, the essential thing underneath the role, is the last thing anyone, including himself, ever looks at again. And then he showed me something else. The grief of what I had seen, because there was grief, a grief so heavy it had no equivalent in anything I had felt in 53 years of living. The grief rose in me, and he received it. He did not dismiss it. He did not explain it away or give it a theological framework that made it easier to carry. He received the grief and held it with me for a moment that had no duration I can measure. And in the holding of the grief, I understood for the first time that the grief was his. That what I was feeling was not my own reaction imported into the experience, but a fraction of what he carries. His grief about every one of those lives. Every moment where the love was available and was not received. Every moment where the construction was more important than the person inside it. And in that grief was a love so specific and so complete that it was impossible to hold the grief and the love separately. They were the same thing. The grief was made of love. The love was expressed as grief. Then he showed me a review of my own life. And this is the part that I need you to stay with, because this is the part that changes everything. I expected the failures. 53 years of living leaves a man with an inventory of failures that could fill a room. There were marriages I hadn't counseled well. People I had said the wrong thing to at the wrong moment. Doctrinal fights I had chosen for reasons that had more to do with pride than principle. Times I had been unkind. Times I had been dismissive. Times I had treated the administration of the church as more important than the person standing in front of me asking for help. I was prepared to see the failures. What I was not prepared for, what destroyed the pastor in me and left only the man, was what had weighed on the other side. What was luminous? What had traveled with me? It was not the sermons. It was not the degrees. It was not the Sunday mornings and the Easter services and the baptisms and the committee meetings and the theological positions I had spent decades defending. It was the afternoon in 1978 when I drove 40 minutes out of my way to sit with a man named Douglas Hepworth who had called me sounding lonely and whom I almost didn't call back because my schedule was full. I sat with him for 2 hours. We didn't talk about theology. We talked about his father and about baseball and about how he had stopped being able to sleep. I drove home and forgot about it within a week. On the other side, that afternoon was luminous. It was a thing of weight and permanence and extraordinary beauty. It radiated. It had traveled through time in a way that the sermons had not. It was the glass of water I handed to a woman outside a grocery store in 1983 who was sitting on the curb in the summer heat and who I didn't know and who I stopped for on impulse and with whom I exchanged perhaps 4 words. She took the water and nodded, and I walked to my car. I never knew her name. I never saw her again. On the other side, those 4 words had traveled further than any sermon I had ever preached. The impulse to stop, the 4 words, the glass of water, they had an architecture that nothing I had built with intention and effort and planning could match. It was the moment in 1969 when my son was 4 years old and afraid of something in his room at night, and I got up instead of staying in bed, and I lay down on the floor next to his bed and held his hand in the dark until he fell asleep. Just his hand in mine. The dark and the quiet, and nothing required of either one of us, except presence. On the other side, that floor, that dark, that hand, they were a cathedral. It was a Tuesday in 1985 when a young man came to my office who was about to lose everything, his business, his marriage, and instead of giving him the 20 minutes I had allocated in my schedule, I cleared the afternoon, and we sat there for 5 hours, and I just listened. I said very little. I mostly listened. I drove home exhausted and told Elaine I hadn't accomplished anything that day. On the other side, that afternoon was one of the most significant things that had ever happened in that office, including the Sunday school preparation and the sermon writing and the pastoral counseling sessions that I had considered the real work. I want you to understand what I am saying. I am a man who spent his entire adult life building something he believed was significant. The denomination, the congregation, the doctorate, the library, the platform, the reputation. And on the other side, the building was invisible. The building was not what had traveled with me. What had traveled with me were the moments when I had stopped performing a role and had simply been present for another human being with nothing to gain from it. Those moments were the only things I brought with me. They were the only things that had the quality of the real. And then I was back. I will not describe the return at length, because the return was violence. It was the absolute reversal of the lifting I described at the beginning. It was the weight returned, the body returned, the credentials returned, the title returned, and with all of it, the grief, his grief, carried at a fraction of what I had perceived, but carrying nonetheless, a thing I have lived with every day for 33 years. The double consciousness that remains with me is the only way I know to describe what I have carried since that day. I am simultaneously the person who died and the person who came back. The person who died knows what the other side is. The person who came back has to live here anyway. To sit in committee meetings and write sermons and answer emails and navigate the small politics of institutional religion while also knowing what all of it weighs in the place where weight is actually measured. Those two people do not always agree. They have not agreed for 33 years. The pastor who walked out of that hospital did not walk back into the same pulpit. He walked back into the same building, used the same words, stood in the same spot. But everything underneath those words was different. The credential that once felt like an identity felt, after that day, like a costume that he wore because the congregation expected it. The authority that once felt earned felt, after that day, like something borrowed from a source that was not the degree or the denomination, but something far older and more immediate and far more demanding. What I have come to believe, what I now know with the certainty that only 52 minutes of documented clinical death can give you, is this: The faith is not the vocabulary. It is not the title. It is not the visibility, the platform, the number of people in the seats on Sunday morning. The faith is what's left when all of that is gone. And what's left when all of that is gone is the man on the floor in the dark holding his son's hand. The man who drove 40 minutes to sit with someone who called sounding lonely. The man who stopped for the glass of water. That is what is weighed. That is what travels. That is what he recognizes. I have told this account publicly for 30 years, and every time I finish, there is always one thing that no one asks that I wish someone would ask. Not about the famous names. Not about the geography of what I saw. The thing I wish someone would ask is simpler. Of all the things that had no weight on the other side, which one surprised you most? The answer is the title. 35 years of ministry, and the title weighed nothing. The man underneath the title was the only thing that arrived. And what that means, for every one of you who has spent your life building a version of yourself that you intend to present on the other side as your credential, is something you need to sit with before you go any further with your day. Tell me in the comments the name of someone in your life who has been like Douglas Hepworth to you. Someone who needed you to stop when you could have kept walking. Someone who needed the glass of water or the hour or the hand in the dark. Tell me about that person, because that is the testimony I want to hear from you. Not the theology, not the doctrine, the person. That is where the weight is. Go find it.